in many ways, his presidency is defined a lot of ways, at least early on, by foreign affairs. And, when Truman takes office, this debate about whether or not a country will be communist or not is crucial. Pretty much from any time a new nation state is formed. And that first raises its head in 1947. So what you're looking at here is actually something that was created in 1919 at the end of World War I. And you may recall that the League of Nations took the Middle East, the defeated region of the Ottoman Empire, and carved it into sort of 5 distinct regions, at least, and 6 if you include the Arabian Peninsula. And one of those was called the British Mandate of Palestine. So during the interwar period from 1919 to 1939, you had hundreds of thousands of Jewish people from Europe migrate to this place, the Mandate of Palestine. Part of that has to do with a British Foreign Secretary, a guy named Balfour, issued something called the Balfour Declaration, which said, we're open to Jewish settlers. The British are comfortable with this. So even before the Holocaust started, there had been some Jews who migrated to this mandate, right, this territory. After the war, there is going to be an enormous increase of people coming to this region because they've been displaced in Europe. Keep in mind, not only were 7 million Jews killed, but the other 13 million Jews of Europe were displaced. They were homeless people. Their land had been, or their homes had been seized. Their wealth had been seized by the Nazis and was hidden. This is the famous Nazi gold or infamous Nazi gold. And so these Jews were homeless, and there was an enormous amount of sympathy towards them around the world. And so the United Nations decided to create within the Mandate of Palestine a 2-state partition. So the UN created one state, which would be the Arab state, the home of the Palestinians. Now, looking at this map, you can tell right away this is a bit of an odd map. Same thing happens in India, where you have Pakistan on 2 sides of the country, right? East and West Pakistan on either side of India. But they're doing this based on actual reality on the ground, which is who lives there. So the yellow areas are predominantly Arab peoples, right? So today, by the way, we call these folks Palestinians. These are the Arabs who live in Palestine. They're Palestinians. And then the Jewish people had their own state in the orange territory, right? So you see the orange, and then Jerusalem would be administered, this great city would be administered by the United Nations. Well, that year, at the end of that year, the Jewish state declared its independence. It would not be part of the Palestinian state, and it would declare itself the state of Israel. And so the state of Israel was born, but until other countries recognize you, that's not a very big deal. Like, I could call myself the state of Touart land, but until other countries recognize that. So the very first country in the world to recognize Israel's independence was America, President Truman. This outraged Secretary of State Marshall so much that he resigned. Secretary Marshall, as well as several other leading figures in Truman's cabinet or his government, quit because they felt like this was not our business. Now, they weren't anti-Semitic. I want to make sure you understand. It wasn't because it was Jewish. They thought that this would create more problems than it would work. So they quit. But Truman felt, it was important to recognize this state. By the way, the next country to recognize it was the Soviet Union. So both us and the Soviets recognized Israel's right to be a country. So you might want to write down in your notes, since it's one of those questions. You know how these smell, all the following except, right? So why did President Truman make this fateful decision? Why did he make this big choice? So this is on the study guide. What question is this? Let me find it. I know it's like, what decision did he make in May of 1948? I don't even have my study guide in front of me. Bad teacher. What did I do with it? Well, anyway, while I'm looking for that, you should be looking over the reasons why ultimately Truman makes this decision. First, he decides this because of sympathy for the survivors of the Holocaust. There's an enormous amount of sympathy in America for these folks, particularly. What is interesting to me, though, guys, is that there were some Jewish people who actually were opposed to this. Orthodox Jewish people believe that, that the actual Messiah would be responsible for restoring Jerusalem and Israel to this rightful place. But nonetheless, yeah, this is on number 5 under the Cold War deepens. Its repercussions are still felt. So number 2, We want to preempt the Soviets. We want to be their friend before the Soviets are. Number three, an important group of Democratic voters, still are, although a lot more now voting Republican than they used to, was the Jewish American vote. Okay. And then number four, Israel stated, and it has been, a democracy. They have a parliament with a Knesset. That's what it's called. The Knesset is the Israeli parliament. By the way, people who live in Israel who are Jewish are called Israelis, right? Not Israelites anymore. And so it's a democratic state in the Middle East, which would be the first of its kind. So be aware of this. I do add a figure who's not mentioned in your book, and I think should be. He's the first African American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. His name is Dr. Ralph Bunche, and he actually negotiated the armistice between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's he who actually mediated that conflict. And because I didn't put it on here, but immediately after Israel declared its independence, every one of its neighboring countries attacked it. Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia all attacked Israel. And Israel surprisingly won. And this is part of the agreement, which is called the Green Line, the division between Arab state and Palestinian state. So you should probably write down Dr. Bunche's name as the first black man, or black person from the United States to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he's actually the first any person of color to win the Nobel Peace Prize, not just American, but any nationality. So we're going to do that. And like I said, it was very controversial, remains controversial. I'm not going to get into the debate about Israel and the Palestinians today, but that was right on. So we talked about Mao's revolution, which had been long coming, right? Over a decade now, or 2 decades in the works. And we talked about the use of the hydrogen bomb. Now, we didn't get into what deterrence actually means, but I want you to understand that when your opponent has a nuclear weapon, or in this case, hundreds of nuclear weapons, and you have hundreds of nuclear weapons, then that means if they're actually used in a war, then it will create mutual assured destruction. Therefore, why fight it? That's deterrence. Don't start a war that ends in nuclear annihilation. That term deterrence means to prevent you from doing something. Prevention, right? So we are prevented really from using these weapons by their very existence. Because if we use ours, then the reality is we have bombers that are going to fly around the clock. And this starts in the next president, particularly. They're known as the Strategic Air Command. And SAC bombs is capable of bombing anywhere. That's what Wallace was writing about in your book about we can fly 10,000 miles and drop a bomb. And they were always in the air. They were refueled in the air. So they then want to do that. But we have the ability to strike them and obliterate them, so they want that ability too. Well, now no one wants to pull the trigger on this because who wins a nuclear war? If a country has 60% fatalities of its nation state, then the irony of a mutually assured destruction war, a nuclear war, is that if it's between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, then the country that wins that war is Chile or Botswana, because everywhere America is will be obliterated, and everywhere Russia is will be obliterated. So the old joke is that World War I was fought in the trenches, and World War II was fought with machine guns and bombers. World War III, if it was fought, would be with nukes, and World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones. No one wins a nuclear war. It's too destructive. So what happens, though, interestingly, is that then leads to a desire to have what is called first strike capability. So now not only do you want to be able to wipe out your opponent, but you've got to be able to wipe them out so successfully that they don't have a chance to retaliate. And that's going to take on a new phase in the 50s when we get to rockets, right? Because do you have a chance to know a bomber is coming? Yeah. Sure. We're going to pick you up on radar. We're going to see you coming. And our bombers have a chance to respond, right? But when we get into the area of missiles, it becomes much more problematic. So when we get to the 50s, we'll talk about how mad gets even worse, so to speak. We get madder, and destruction becomes more likely. Now, another area of conflict that emerges is in Asia. Now, a lot of students aren't aware of how did Korea end up divided. So I thought I'd give you some notes here. At the end of World War II, the Russians, the Soviets, had invaded Korea with the intent, of fighting the Japanese there. Japan had occupied Korea since the turn of the century, 1905. And the Soviet Union took over a good chunk of northern Korea. And so the U.S. had some diplomats in the area, and I don't remember their names, and I don't think you need to know them either. But they made a proposal like right away to the Soviets to divide Korea where they were. Now, the good news is I think it's probably a good thing they did this, because if not, the Soviets could just kept on going. Yeah. Right? Right. So then it would have just been Korea was under communism. But what happens is they had drawn a sort of line, which is called the 38th parallel. So a line of latitude, the flat lines, are called parallels because they run like that way, parallel to each other. And so when the Soviet Union accepted the 38th, Americans were like, oh, good. All right, that means we won't have to fight them. So in the north, you can see here the 38th parallel divides Korea. They had a dictator who took power, whose name was Kim, and we're on the third Kim now, right? And these guys are really, really bizarre figures, to say the least. But they're going to govern with an iron hand, backed primarily by the Chinese. So the Chinese have done China will be their major trade partner, the Soviets to a lesser degree. And so that's their sphere. And in the South, you'll have a democratically elected president named Syngman Rhee. And so we are paying attention to this, but not too overtly concerned. But without warning, in an event that we weren't expecting really at the time, the North Koreans launch an attack across the 38th parallel. Now, it's a civil war. For all intents and purposes, this is North Koreans fighting South Koreans. But when President Truman sees this, he believes it's the spread of communism. When American planners see this, well, hey, Kim's a communist. He's backed by the Chinese and the Soviets. They just invaded a country that's spreading communism, right? And so President Truman and his supporters will begin arguing for what is now known as the domino theory. You should know the domino theory. Now, it's mostly going to relate to Southeast Asia, to Indochina. But even so, it becomes sort of a fear that American planners have, is that if a nation state in the region becomes communist, then like falling dominoes, so will other countries around it. Right. And communism will thus spread, sort of like a dominoes falling, right? And that's not what they don't want it to. That's right. They want to contain it. But the problem is like, does the American public have the desire to invade or fight in another part of the world, 5 years after World War II is over? Yeah. So one of the things that comes out of this is a memorandum, and it's called the memorandum, which, if you remember the National Security Act of 1947, it created a new advisory panel to the president called the National Security Council. All right, and led by the National Security Advisor, who's going to be immediately an important figure. All right, the National Security Advisor sits in the White House. This is the person that briefs the president every day. And the National Security Council said, we must intervene, right? We must intervene to stop the spread of communism, but we should also quadruple our defense spending. Now, quadrupling it, to pay for the Korean War, they should have probably increased it by doubling it, right? Quadrupling it is going to create a whole new dynamic of the Cold War, because what it tells the world, we're spending $50 billion a year in military spending. And so by 1952, that'll be over 10% of our GNP, our gross national product, will be on just military spending. And but what Truman calculates, and I think he was probably right, is that our economy was so strong, right, particularly in the 50s, and I did this too, is that it says we can handle it. And that's what the National Security Council said. We can afford this, but we have to invest in preventing the Korean War from continuing. So we had President Truman sends Adlai Stevenson to, Secretary Atchison goes to the United Nations, and there they request a United Nations Security Council resolution of force. Never happened before, a use of force by the United Nations. Now, good news for us, the Russians they were absent that day. Yeah, they're abstaining there. And keep in mind, this is still nationalist China, still has the vote on the Security Council. Yeah. Communist China doesn't get the vote yet. So with a successful vote, no veto, the United Nations authorizes the use of forces in Korea. They are protesting now by boycotting it, right? So there's a debate about whether or not it was protesting it or if they were just choosing not to be there because they were mad at the Koreans for starting this, right? there's an interesting argument about whether or not the Korean War was started without letting Stalin know, because it's kind of like it affects him, obviously, or Mao. So what happens, though, we get the vote, and the vote authorizes the use of force. Now, a lot of countries are going to be represented in Korea, but we make over over 80% of the force. So when we talk about the UN police action, that is Korea, it's really an American war with help from about 15% of other countries. All right, so we definitely want to remember this as a war, but it's known in history as a UN police action. Now, if you look here in the first year of the war, if you're looking at the orange color, so the orange color is the North Koreans. And the North Koreans come slamming into South Korea unexpectedly. They push past Seoul, and within 3 months, the South Korean forces are cornered in what is called the Pusan perimeter. Pusan is this little city in the southeast, right? Now, who was our governor general right across the pond here? Here's Japan over here. MacArthur, right? Here's MacArthur, who is the governor general of Japan when the Korean War breaks out. Now, he's already commanded our troops in the Pacific, right? He's already been in Japan, so he's right next door. And so President Truman orders General MacArthur to take control of the UN forces at Pusan. So here's where we are. Our UN forces are in this little corner. And MacArthur pulls off his greatest military move yet. And that is he divides his forces in front of the North Koreans. He divides. So he pulls off a kind of Stonewall Jackson maneuver here. He puts them on landing vessels and lands them at this bay that seems to be impossible for people to land at. And yet he gets them there. This is called in history the miracle at Incheon, or the Incheon landing. So we land the U.S. forces at Incheon behind the North Koreans and slam into their slam into their back, right? And so the North Koreans scatter. They just scatter to the winds. They run up. There's a bunch of mountains in this part of Korea, eastern and northern Korea. So they run to the mountains. They run to the hills. We begin pursuing them all the way back to the Yalu River. Here's the Yalu River. All right, the Yalu River forms the border of China and North Korea.
And that's what China is.
And that's exactly right. And so within the spring, at Christmas time of that year, Christmas 1950, 1 million volunteer Chinese crossed the Yalu River and attack America. So I would argue that MacArthur had overextended his mission all the way to China. But, why not? We're beating the North Koreans like a redheaded stepchild kind of thing. So they're retreating, and he didn't believe for a second the Chinese would intervene. And boy, was that a mistake. Because when the Chinese intervene, then what do we do? Well, if you look here, they're going to drive us, and this is where you have this brutal winter fighting in 50-51 on a frozen reservoir called Chosan. So on the frozen tundra of the Chosan Reservoir, and all of this up here is cold and mountainous, our guys are pushed back to January of 51, right about here again. So after the first year, the two sides have basically realigned back at the 38th parallel. Yeah, right. Well, at this point, General MacArthur is very insistent that he wants to use every weapon in the American arsenal, that includes nukes if necessary, against China. And Truman says, now he meets with Truman, and he really, embarrasses Truman. He makes the president wait for him. This is where he tries to gamble, MacArthur does, and loses. He starts writing letters to congressmen and reporters saying, the president, this mission is constrained because we're fighting a limited war. That's exactly what Harry Truman wants to do. He does not want to broaden the war to China, because if we involve the Chinese, he argues, that could also involve the Soviets, and that's World War III, right? So right now we're fighting what's called a contained war. If we fight the war into China, it won't be contained anymore. And he listens to MacArthur and explains that politically we can't do this without risking World War III. MacArthur tries to, second guess him, and Truman feels he has no option but to fire General MacArthur. Now, he doesn't officially fire him. You can't, you don't just fire five-star generals. He relieves him from command, which means you're no longer in charge of the Korean War. When that happens, MacArthur retires. I mean, he could have retired at any point anyway. And then he decides he's going to run for president in 1952. I don't know exactly for sure what MacArthur's long-term plans are. One biographer of MacArthur calls him America's Caesar, the American Caesar. It's an interesting argument. But nonetheless, by 1952, we're back to the 38th parallel. And I'll leave it at that because in 52, we're going to have an election, and then President Eisenhower in 53 is going to go personally to Korea, and they're going to end up negotiating. Oh, I guess I won't leave it. I'll tell you. In 1953, we negotiate and we form a truce, an armistice. Remember what those are? It's an agreement to stop fighting. It's not a surrender. It's not a peace treaty. It's just we're stopping fighting. So from 1953 to present, we've been in an armistice with North Korea. We never agreed to officially end the Korean War. We just aren't fighting them anymore. So that will be the end to this. And today South Korea is extraordinarily successful. North Korea is a failed state, and nonetheless, the North Koreans continually try to make nukes. And we know the real reason they're trying to make a nuke. It's not to nuke South Korea. They want to unify Korea. They don't want to blow it all up smithereens. They're not going to nuke Japan. They're trying to use it to have a sort of flex, a muscle to kind of bring America to the table to negotiate. America is only negotiating from a position of strength. So if the North Koreans have a nuclear weapon, then they can sort of argue that they have some strength, right? They could use this, but if you know the Kims, they're not going to use a nuke because it'll mean their death. And the only thing they care most about is themselves. So North Korea is absolutely a failed state today. And by the way, this is an enormously unpopular decision by President Truman. This is one of the reasons why when he leaves office in 52, he's very unpopular. MacArthur was an enormously beloved figure in the public. He just wasn't as beloved as Dwight D. Eisenhower. So he's not going to get the Republican Party's nomination. Ike will. So anywho, be aware of that. Now, during Truman's presidency, we're going to have something that occurs that reminds me of something that occurred earlier in history. If you go back to the 1920s, we had the first Red Scare, right? Except when did the first Red Scare really take place? 1919 and 1920, which are really under Wilson, right? Well, the Red Scare second Red Scare is most associated with the 50s. And it should be. In your mind, you should think the 50s. But for 4.5 years, it occurs in the 40s. So the second Red Scare is also a product of President Truman and during the 50s, not just the 50s. So I don't want y'all to make that mistake. So why does the second Red Scare occur? Well, I think the real reason there are several. There are several reasons. And so you should definitely be familiar with these. Let's start with that the perception of communism as atheistic, right? And so in America in the 50s, you had a lot of people who were becoming not so religious. And they would often be seen as commies in our country for being irreligious or worse yet, sacrilegious, right? So that downturn, and by the way, when religion goes down, that's when it's most likely to be met with a sort of revival. And we will have a huge revival in the 1950s. All right, a televised revival with Billy Graham and others. So there was this sense that the communists' anti-religious attitudes were spreading in America. Like the 20s, there was a sexual liberation front. Young people were becoming more and more either promiscuous or open in discussing things of sexuality. And so that was associated with communists. Communists were responsible for that. If you were a civil rights activist like Dr. Martin Luther King, you were called a communist. All right. So pretty much this would become a label for anyone who was seen as sort of the other, even if they were Americans, even if they were our country's people. And then lastly, Democrats would be blamed as communists, or if not communists, soft on communism. So all of these sort of attitudes. Now, what this should tell you is then that means Republicans, who are the party of tradition, are going to be able to capitalize on this politically. So if you think about things like the Red Scare, guys like Truman will feel he has to have something to prove. Guys like Kennedy will have something to prove. So as a party, the Republicans are going to be very smart about this by basically tarring all four of those things as Democratic, right? Like if you want to vote for the party that is sacrilegious and the party that is comfortable with that this is a period where homosexuality began to be discussed. So that's this. Now I want to show you what really happens with the Red Scare that makes this so, I think, so invasive in the lives of everyday people. So first of all, President Truman kicks off the Red Scare, the second Red Scare, with something called the Loyalty Review Board. They're going to review millions of current federal employees, right? And tens of thousands of them will either quit or get fired. So this is a real period where it's a crackdown, making sure that there's, infiltration of assault on communists or alleged communists in our government. States all across the country, states will pass anti-communist ordinances requiring loyalty oaths of teachers, things like that. Now, the Smith Act had actually been created during World War II, but it was a law banning sedition. And here you can see communists will be prosecuted, 11 actual communists. By the way, in America, historically, it's not illegal to be a communist. It's a political philosophy. It's not like, it's a belief. It's not a action. But you're going to have 11 communists arrested and imprisoned for this. And they will be upheld on another Supreme Court case, a la Schenck. You guys remember that one? Or a la Debs. So if you go back to the 1920s, when the Supreme Court said, clear and present danger, they're going to continue to say, who pose a clear and present danger? Communists. So this is a period where being a communist was illegal in America. And that's a political belief. That's not I'm not a communist. I don't support it, but I do believe that you should have the right to believe what you want to believe, as long as you're not shooting people, But the Congress is going to get involved in this, and they're going to investigate, and you're going to have the formation of HUAC. So you definitely want to know what this is. HUAC is mentioned under number 2, and HUAC's most famous member by far is Richard Nixon. Okay, so this is Congressman Nixon. He's a freshman congressman, just been elected out in California, and he sees this as an opportunity, and he goes after a very popular figure amongst the Democratic intellectuals. His name is Alger Hiss, who worked for Dean Acheson. Dean Acheson was the Secretary of State. He worked for Harry Truman, and he is going to be alleged to be a spy. All right. Congressman Nixon says Mr. Hiss has been spying on America. He has a fellow who testifies saying Hiss gave him information. That fellow turns out to be not very, very trustworthy, but Hiss is caught telling a lie, and so he commits perjury, and he'll go to jail for perjury, and Nixon will become a household name in America. He's the red hunter. He's the anti-communist. And even before there was McCarthy, there was Richard Nixon. Okay? Definitely be familiar with that. We'll have an enormous effort to find out the spies of our secret atomic weapons. And it's these two folks who were at the Manhattan, who were in Los Alamos. One of them was. This is Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. And the Rosenbergs are going to be convicted of espionage. And they were parents. They had children. So there will be sort of a cry to not have them sentenced to death. But they will be. They'll be executed for treason. These two for espionage. And that's the only time that's ever happened in America in peacetime. They'll be executed at the electric chair. Okay? So that's the Rosenbergs. And by all accounts, they were guilty of it. They were spying on America, and giving secrets to the Russians. But now, because of that, there was a feeling that there were spies everywhere. There would be a sense that there were spies everywhere. And that was an alarming development. So I told you about Hiss. This is a law passed that year, a year before actually, called the McCarran Act. And the McCarran Act will be to, require anyone who's affiliated with communism to register their group, where they'll then be, of course, probably targeted for discrimination. And anything that was considered un-American was a federal crime. So this is where flag waving and proving that you were a dutiful patriot was enshrined in law, right? The McCarran Internal Security Act. So, oh yeah, it's super nationalistic, even jingoistic, right?
Yeah, very.
All right, and so during this, Truman vetoes this one. Right? He did start the Loyalty Review Board, right? But he thought this went too far. It gave him too. Ironically, he thought it gave the president too much authority, and Congress will override this. They'll actually pass. Keep in mind, Congress is Republican now, and they're hoping that a Republican president will utilize this bill. So, they're passing bills for the future, so to speak, as well as the president. This is the Internal Security Act. The president could basically lock people up under this thing, okay? Yeah, well, Ike isn't going to, Ike is going to be present during most of this bill, and he's not going to utilize it much for that purpose. Then comes this guy. All right.
Joe McCarthy.
So, yeah, this is Senator McCarthy. His critics would call him Tail Gunner Joe for his lack of actual service in World War II much, but nonetheless, he was as frequently spoke, the junior senator from Wisconsin. And what McCarthy did is, out of the kind of blue sky one day, he raised a piece of paper saying that the Secretary of State employed over 200 communists, known communists, in the State Department. Now, Atchison is routinely going to be the target of this kind of attack. Keep in mind, this is the after China has gone communist, right? And so this is the party that is soft on communism. Therefore, they must employ communists, right? Or at the very least, communist sympathizers. So he is going to then say, hold trials, basically Senate hearings, Senate investigation hearings, and he's going to bring people on TV. So this is going to be a televised spectacle, okay, in 1950. And people are going to watch, and really he gets more and more popular. And, he's going to accuse more and more people of being communists, or at the very least soft on communism. By the way, once your name was aired on this thing, your career was done. Like you were publicly shamed, so to speak. Yeah. So McCarthy is going to get kind of like so many demagogues, and he is a demagogue. He's going to get carried away with his own power, right? And he's going to start identifying. Well, actually, when he's asked to identify the communists by name, he can't prove it. Like he keeps hedging on that. And then he accuses the Defense Department, particularly the U.S. Army, of being communist or having communist leadership. That was the biggest. And when that occurs during President Eisenhower's presidency, and when that happens, Eisenhower tells the Army to stop sending witnesses to McCarthy's hearing. He just cuts him off. Ike says, all right, I'm done with this guy. Now, Ike would not actually, Ike didn't do anything initially to take on McCarthy. Initially, he just kind of he said, I'm not going to get down in the gutter with this guy. McCarthy is the very worst nature of the American public, as far as representation. He's a fearmonger. And he's destroying lives, particularly him and Nixon when it came to Hollywood. They're going to go after Hollywood for its influence of the American public, right? Yeah. And, there were some people in Hollywood who were leftists, if not overtly sympathetic of communism. But nonetheless, McCarthy is going to continue to do this. And when he takes on the Army, he really begins to attract the attention of one journalist in particular. And this guy works for CBS. And he's worked for CBS since the war, and actually even before, in radio. And now he is the most popular TV anchor of all. And back then, when you watch TV, there were no 24-hour news networks. There's only one time a day you watch the news, right? And so you get your 6:30 or 7 o'clock news time, depending on which show. And during this show, Edward R. Murrow would come on and report the news. And so no one in the media wanted to take on McCarthy. Well, Murrow was so famous. Keep in mind, this is the guy who broadcast the bombing of London, the Battle of Britain, to us directly. He was a well-known American figure, and he was probably the most respected journalist ever. And Edward R. Murrow took on McCarthy. He started going after the junior senator from Wisconsin and showing where he was lying. And he even had McCarthy on to talk. And once Ike pulled the plug on the Army and Murrow kept hammering away at McCarthy, McCarthy then tried to accuse, of all people, Secretary of State, former Chief of Staff, former General George Marshall, right? Right. And so at this point, you see this guy right here, this guy with his hand on his head, right? This is Joe Welch, who was the lawyer for the Army. All right. And he very famously on TV, when McCarthy continued to sort of slander a young private, said, "Sir, have you any decency? At long last, sir, do you have any decency?" Right. And with that, people were like, you know what, McCarthy went too far. Now, not everybody, but just about everybody who were kind of following the public recognized that McCarthy had done a very ugly thing here. And he would be censured, criticized, by the Senate. They would make a statement saying this. And the next year, he would drink himself to death. All right. So 50 or 56, 55 or 56. He died of somewhere around in there of alcohol poisoning or alcohol cirrhosis of the liver, too much alcohol. Now, the thing about McCarthy, besides being his name is now associated with witch hunt, So like if you are pursuing people who are guilty until proven innocent, which is not how our society is supposed to work, that's McCarthyism, right? But one of the things that he's going to do by going after the State Department, a lot of the people whose careers he's going to destroy are experts on Southeast Asia. And these people, it's argued, would have understood what was going on in Indochina and said, this should not be part of this domino theory Cold War stuff. This is an independent nationalist movement, right? But they were all gone. They're all out. And so the people who, it's kind of like a purge of the State Department. The people who were experts at understanding were years of being there. And they were Democrats, but they were not all of them. A lot of them were career employees. They just worked for 30 years for the State Department and quit when this started to happen. Like, I'm not going to deal with this guy, right? So McCarthy's going to have the sort of expected, and the book talks about this, deprivation of the State Department of experts on Southeast Asia. And boy, does that not pay off. So McCarthy is very much a figure you should know, okay? Now, the last notes for today have to do with how the Cold War was a part of a religious resurgence in America. Truman was very much responsible for this too. I mean, not solely, but Truman framed it as a war against like evil. You understand? Reagan is later going to call the Soviet Union the nexus of evil in the world, an evil empire. So the language used by the American class, like leadership class, about the Soviets was often this. But into this stepped a guy named Reinhold Niebuhr, and I would like you to know that name, Reinhold Niebuhr, who was very, very influential. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to study under this man. Okay, he was a liberal Protestant who believed that communism was the greatest threat to America ever. The threat to Christianity, the threat to freedom, and so he was very influential, both as a thinker and intellectual, but also as a figure who kind of motivated the American people to recognizing what is it about America that makes us American, like versus other countries. So I put up here what he's probably most famous for, which is the Serenity Prayer. You guys know the Serenity Prayer, the Alcoholics AA prayer? I'm really a fan of it. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change, the courage to fight the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? So that's a very famous phrase. All right. But I also put down here a slide I grabbed a copy of. Definitely want to recognize that things that the jingoism, so to speak, of America is going to resurge heavy. You have the inclusion for the first time in history of under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Before the 50s, that wasn't a thing. The national motto is created, "In God We Trust." So the idea of these things are new. They're from the 50s. And the reason for them is to kind of reassert the religious values of the United States. So you'll have Niebuhr, who's a minister, Pastor Reinhold Niebuhr. You're going to have the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition being taught as a concept in American history. And also you're going to have evangelists who become national celebrities. All right. Well, yeah, but not just, they're going to have mass rallies and mass in person. So I mentioned Billy Sunday back in the 20s was the most famous sort of revivalist. In the 50s, it will be Billy Graham and Oral Roberts. So very much a period where we're transitioning into overt religiosity again. And that happens throughout American history where, we kind of get material comfort. And at the same time, pastors are like, don't forget to think on heaven, and stuff like that. Well, this was much more about against the sort of evil of the specter of communism. Now, when we get to the 50s chapter, we're going to see movies like that feature aliens, right? And they live among us and stuff like that. And those were really about communists. They were a metaphor for the communists of that day. So I think it's kind of fascinating. So tomorrow, or what's today? Thursday, we will take up the economic and home life of the late 1940s. Your book actually takes you into the 1950s in this chapter, which it calls The Cold War Begins. And then it has a whole section on the domestic front, which used to be kind of another chapter. So we're going to put the Cold War on hold and come back and do the domestic front. And then after that, we will continue on with Eisenhower. So I'm going to pause the recording and see if there's anything I can explain further.